that was turned into a rock climbing centre. And here's a church. It's happened all across. All across Europe. Here's a church that was turned into a Sikh temple. And here's a church that was turned into a rock climbing centre. And here's a church that you can see was turned into a museum, and this one was It's happened all across Europe. Here's a church that was turned into a Sikh temple. And here's a church that was turned into a rock climbing centre. And here's a church that you can see was turned into a museum, and this one was turned into a theatre. Here's a church that was turned into an information centre, and this church here was turned into a clothing store, this one into a habitat shop, this one into a music store, this one into a liquor store, this one into a nightclub, this one into a tattoo and piercing studio. It's happening all across the United Kingdom, all across Europe. The Great Commission for the Church is to go into all the world and preach the gospel. And certainly the church has had an incredible influence on our Western culture in the past. But today, we see the collapse of our Western civilization from a Christian perspective. The Bible tells us we're in a spiritual war, and there's no doubt from a human perspective. Europe, here's a church that was turned into a Sikh temple. And here's a church that was turned into a rock climbing centre. And here's a church that you can see was turned into a museum, and this one was turned into a theatre. Here's a church that was turned into an information centre, and this church here was turned into a clothing store, this one into a habitat shop, this one into a music store, this one into a liquor store, this one into a nightclub, this one into a tattoo and piercing studio. It's happening all across the United Kingdom, all across Europe. The Great Commission for the Church is to go into all the world and preach the gospel. And certainly the church has had an incredible influence on our Western culture in the past. But today, we see the collapse of our Western civilization from a Christian perspective. The Bible tells us we're in a spiritual war, and there's no doubt from a human perspective, the church seems to be losing that war. So what has happened? What's the real nature of the problem? How can we once again see the church be effective in reaching our culture for the Lord Jesus Christ and overcome the secularization that is before us? Well, that's what this session is all about, to help us understand the times, to understand the real nature of the spiritual battle before us, and to be able to deal with that so we can once again see the church being effective in touching the culture for the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm sure many of you, like me, are very concerned at where this nation is heading. Not so much economically. I know we're all concerned about the economic problems in this nation, but spiritually. And it's not just America, it's the whole Western world. Do you realize right now we're living in an interesting era of history? We're living in a time, I'm sure many of us are concerned, what sort of nation are we bringing our children up in? What sort of world are we bringing our grandchildren up in? What's going on? What's happening? It's not just America, it's the whole Western world. We see the collapse of the Christian fabric, the collapse of the Christian worldview. Why is this happening? I believe a Ministry of Answers in Genesis has really been raised up at this time to help people understand what is happening and what to do about it. And I want to go through 4 verses of scripture that to me will really help us understand what is going on and why it's happening and what the solution to these issues are. In 1 Chronicles 12:32, we read about the sons of Issachar who had understanding of the times. And I want to ask us, do we have understanding of the times? Do we know what is happening in our nation and in our Western world? We need to have understanding of the times. These were men who had understanding it was time for David to be king. But do we have understanding of the times we live in? Psalm 11:3 tells us, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? What's happened in our nation is that there's been a foundation that has come under attack. It's the foundation of the authority of the Word of God. And that foundation has come under attack right throughout our Western world. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us, always be prepared to give a defense, or as the King James puts it, to give an answer. Always be prepared to give an answer, to defend the faith. One of the problems that we found today is that most Christians don't know how to answer the skeptical questions of the age. Most Christians don't know how to give a defense. In fact, that word defense, or the word answer, is translated from the Greek word apologia, from which we get our word apologetics. And that word has the sense of meaning of give an answer back, to give a logical reason defense of the faith. One of the things that we should be doing today is making sure that we're raising up generations who understand how to give a defense of the faith. And we need to be teaching apologetics. Most Christian parents aren't teaching their children apologetics. Most churches aren't teaching apologetics. It's a real problem throughout Christendom. Mark 16:15 says, go into all the world and preach the gospel. We need to go out there and preach the gospel. But you know, we live in an increasingly skeptical culture in which many people don't even listen to the gospel because they don't believe the book from which it comes. And we need to understand how we're going to approach such people. I want to show you a little video clip here about the nation of England. Because what's happening in England is happening in America. It should be a warning for us. Where England is today, America will be tomorrow. Watch this clip, and then let's discuss this in a bit more detail.
The coronation of Queen Elizabeth. Like British monarchs before her, she promised to maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel. But Britain today is at war with the gospel and with itself.
Yesterday, I got a letter from the Advertising Standards Authority of a complaint saying that my billboard that says Britain is a Christian country is offensive to atheists and other religions, and it incites hatred against them. What nonsense.
There's been a massive move by the secularist lobby to privatise religion. You can have faith so long as it doesn't affect you in the workplace, so long as you don't bring it into the workplace. Just make it private.
By some estimates, it only took about 10 years to almost completely undermine Britain's Christian heritage. Barring a sudden move of God, it's likely to take far longer to restore it.
You know, that news report should be a warning for all of us, because what is happening in England is happening in America. America's going the same way. And, you know, when you go to England today, in fact, the whole United Kingdom, let me show you some photographs that are the norm, not the exception of what's happening in the United Kingdom. It's happened all across Europe. Here's a church that was turned into a Sikh temple. And here's a church that was turned into a rock climbing center. And here's a church that you can see was turned into a museum, and this one was turned into a theatre. Here's a church that was turned into an information centre, and this church here was turned into a clothing store, this one into a habitat shop, this one into a music store, this one into a liquor store, this one into a nightclub, this one into a tattoo and piercing studio. It's happening all across the United Kingdom, all across Europe. Back a couple of years ago, Penguin Books actually published a book called Killing God in England. And they did their own survey, and they said this, that nearly 2/3 of teenagers don't believe in God. By the way, if 2/3 of the next generation don't believe in God, where's the culture going to be in another couple of generations? Where's the church going to be in another couple of generations? A news source a few years ago in England said this, that the Christian church in this country will be dead and buried within 40 years. And of course, that's exactly what we see is happening all across that nation. My wife and I were over in England in 2009, March 2009, and the day before we left, we bought the newspaper, and the headline on the front page of the newspaper said, I want to see the flag of Allah flying over Downing Street, and Downing Street is where the Prime Minister lives, and also had in their newspaper saying, through jihad, we'll fly the flag of Allah above Downing Street. This is happening over there in the United Kingdom, and people, we need to look at America, need to look at our whole Western world. What is going on? Do we really understand the times? In 2010, there was a global atheist convention in Australia. I don't know whether you know this, but the atheists are really on the march. You know, when I was a teenager, atheists would say something like this, oh, we don't believe that stuff about Christianity. We don't agree with you people. But atheists today are very different. The atheists today would say, oh, we don't believe that stuff, and Christians are bad people, and we've got to stop them doing what they're doing, and we've got to stop them teaching their kids about the Bible, and we've got to marginalize them. We've got to do something about these Christians. That's what's happening happening in England. People, it's increasingly happening in America. The atheists have become very, very aggressive. And one of the major newspapers in Australia, in reporting on the atheist convention that was held there, made this statement. It said, the number of churchgoers in Australia is about 9% and dwindling. The diversity of spiritual belief is flourishing, and atheism is going off like a frog in a sock. Now, if you want to know what a frog in a sock means, that's an Australian term, by the way. It just means it's taking off, just so that you've learned some Australian here in doing that as well. And by the way, there were photographs taken of the atheists in Australia wearing their T-shirts proudly, saying that they're an atheist, and there were ads on buses saying atheism, celebrate reason. What about Canada? What about America's northern neighbour? Well, this news source says this: weekly church attendance dropped to just over 30% in 1975 and around 20% by the year 2000. The assumption has been that the percentage will continue to drop as Canada becomes more secularised. That is, it has been expected that church attendance in Canada will soon reach the levels of Western Europe, where it's dropped below 10% in most countries. We realise our whole Western world is changing. But what about America? I mean, this has been, I would call it the greatest Christianized nation on earth. You can't say a nation has been truly Christian, but certainly the greatest Christianized nation on earth. Do you realize in America you have the largest number of churches and seminaries and Christian colleges and Bible colleges and Christian bookstores, Christian resources, Christian radio, Christian TV? Actually, in America you have more Christian resources right now than any other country in the world. And you have more Christian resources right now than you've ever had in your history. Let me ask this: for all the Christian resources that we have in America, would you say, as a culture, a big picture perspective, is it becoming more Christian every day or less Christian? What would you say? Less Christian. People, there is something wrong here. Why is not the church touching the culture? I mean, the church has more resources than it's ever had. We have mega churches across America. We have all these programs. We have all these resources, more than you've ever had in your history. And yet the church is not touching the culture like it used to. Why? I suggest to you, because the culture has actually invaded the church. And you know what we're seeing happening across America? Just like the United Kingdom. Churches like this one that was turned into a museum, and this one that was turned into a town hall, and this one into a martial arts center, and this one that was turned into a music store. Yes, we're seeing that happening across America, and we're seeing these moral issues pervading the nation. Who would have ever thought? Can you imagine if you went back to the 60s or the 50s or even before that and said to the culture back then, do you realize that in the 21st century in America they'll have legalized abortion, they'll be legalizing gay marriage, they'll throw in God and the Bible and prayer out of the public schools, they would be eliminating Christian symbols from public places like the Ten Commandments and nativity scenes, crosses? And I think people back then would have said, no, not in America. Oh yes, in America. In April 2009, Newsweek on the front cover had this headline: The Decline and Fall of Christian America. And inside they had an article with the heading, The End of Christian America. Who would have ever thought that Newsweek would be saying, this is the end of Christian America? In fact, they did their survey and they said the percentage of self-identified Christians has fallen in America, and that the number of people willing to describe themselves as atheist or agnostic has increased. By the way, the number that they said were atheist was about 3 million. 3 million compared to 300 odd million in this nation is a very small percentage, but do you realize that they have the most effect on this culture? Why? What about all the people who call themselves Christian? How come it's a very small minority, if I can say it that way, that are having such an effect on the whole culture, influencing the entire culture? What's wrong with God's people? Where are we? We've got more Christian resources than we've ever had. You know, one of the people who understands that this nation is changing and who actually supports the change that's occurring in this nation was President Obama. I'm not trying to get political in saying this. I just want to quote President Obama himself so you understand what he's saying about this nation. In his book called The Audacity of Hope, which was published before he was elected president, he made this statement. He said, whatever we once were, we are no longer. Whatever we once were, we are no longer just a Christian nation. We're also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, a Buddhist nation, a Hindu nation, a nation of non-believers. What does he really mean by that? Well, let's listen to President Obama himself and then look at a few more of his quotes to understand what he's saying about the nation of America. Remember what he said during his inauguration address.
We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. We are shaped by every language and culture.
And then in 2009, when President Obama visited Turkey, Speaking with the president of Turkey, he said this.
You know, I've said before that one of the great strengths of the United States is, although as I mentioned, we have a very large Christian population, we do not consider ourselves a Christian nation or a Jewish nation or a Muslim nation. We consider ourselves a nation of citizens who are bound by ideals and a set of values.
Let me ask you a question. Whose ideals and whose values? Because you see, if it doesn't come from an absolute authority, God, the Bible, then who decides? It's whoever is in power decides what those ideals and values are. It all becomes relative on who can impose those on a culture. When President Obama said, whatever we once were, we are no longer, he actually sees it as a positive thing. Whatever we once were, we're no longer. And telling people around the world, look, America has changed, and this is a good thing. In fact, I can show you that he believes it's a good thing from some of the other things that has happened in this nation. For instance, back in 2009, President Obama declared that June of that year, 2009, was to be Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Pride Month and called upon Americans to support that. He also said in 2009, he said, my expectation is that when you look back on these years, you will see a time in which we as a nation finally recognize relationships between two men and two women as just as real and admirable as relationships between a man and a woman. When you have the President of the United States saying it's important to understand marriage is not just to be a man and a woman. You've got to allow a man, a woman, and so on. And this is a great change. This is a positive step forward. You know that America's in trouble. And then it's interesting to note that in 2010, on the White House website, President Obama said, an important chapter in our great unfinished story is the movement of fairness and equality on behalf of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. Across my administration, openly LGBT employees are serving at every level. And then he said, now therefore I, Barack Obama, President of the United States of America, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and laws of the United States, do hereby proclaim June 2010 as Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Pride Month, and again called upon Americans to support it. People, America has changed. Whatever we once were, we are no longer. The secular humanists are talking about this in a very positive way. For instance, a secular humanist magazine called Free Inquiry, the edition that was published in February of 2010, had on the front page the heading Fading Faith and had a picture of a bombed out church and steeple representing the decaying church or the collapsing church. And they said this in an article inside, a historic transition is occurring, barely noticed, slowly, quietly, imperceptibly. Religion is shriveling in America as it already has in Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, across the developed world. Increasingly, supernatural faith belongs to the third world. The first world is entering the long predicted secular age where science and knowledge dominate. And we're seeing the consequences of this transition, the consequences of this change. Who would have ever thought that a university in Texas would have an atheist group on campus that would set up a booth and encourage students to exchange their Bibles for pornography? It was called the Bibles for Porn campaign. Who would have ever thought that that would happen in an American university? But yes, that sort of thing is happening. Who would have ever thought that in America we'd see the atheists becoming very aggressive in getting their message out across America, putting billboards up across the nation in many, many states, in many cities, ads on buses, ads on subways, like this one here from Cincinnati, don't believe in God, you are not alone. This one in Chicago, are you good without God? Millions are. This one in Dallas, Fort Worth, this one in Iowa on a bus, and in Seattle at Christmas time there was this billboard put up, yes, Virginia, there is no God. These are the sorts of things not just happening in America, by the way, it's all across our Western world. You go over to London, you see those sorts of ads on buses and on the subways as well. The atheists have become very, very aggressive. Where are the Christians? How come the atheists are having such an influence on the culture when they're such a small group? And we need to understand what is happening as professors in universities are teaching students in this nation. I want to show you a video clip of a professor from Arizona State University as he spoke in 2009 at an atheist conference. I want you to realize that increasingly we're seeing these sort of people in positions of authority at our educational institutions. Listen to what this university professor from Arizona was saying and listen to the reaction at the end.
The amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They're created in the nuclear furnaces of stars, and the only way they can get into your body is if the stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Okay? And anyway, this is great.
So forget Jesus, the stars died so that you could be here today. And you know, they mock at us for believing in an infinite creator God, and they say, how stupid can you get? And here they are saying stars exploded and the stardust in your right hand came from a different star than your left hand, and so on. Openly mocking Christianity. And they're allowed to do that. But if Christians try to say anything about God or the Bible in the public school, they're threatened to be taken to court. Whatever we once were, we are no longer. You know, I wanted to go through those, and that's just a sample of what's happening in our Western world, just a sample of what's happening in America. There's much more that's going on, but I wanted you to look at that and understand something, because we see that and say, wow, look how bad the culture's becoming. Look what's happening to the culture. And I say, wait a minute, stand back for a moment. I want you to think about something. Why is that happening to the culture? I suggest to you because we have a major problem in our church. See, one of the things that we have found is this. George Barna did some research back in 2002, and George Barna found that two-thirds of young people in our churches, by the time they reach college age, are going to walk away from the church. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what is happening here? In fact, he reconfirmed this in 2006, that about two-thirds of young people, about 70% of young people, when they reach college age, are going to walk away from the church. That means, by the way, if you take the average church, and even though I know there are exceptions, but you take the average church and you to take all the students in that church, all the children, line them up from kindergarten right up to college age, and then say, let's take two-thirds of them, let's march them out of the church. They're going to leave. That's what's going to happen. By the way, if that keeps happening in our churches, where's the church in America going to be? It'll be where England is today. We'll be shutting down churches across this nation. Because once you lose the next generation, what's going to happen? And people, we're losing the next generation. It only takes one generation to lose an entire culture. Where's the church going to be in America if we keep going the way that we are? That's one of the reasons why we commissioned a research project with Britt Beamer from America's Research Group. Was published in the book called Already Gone, a research project where we said to Britt Beamer, we want you to go and find out why and when these young people are leaving the church. And he did that. He did the research. He interviewed 1,000 people in their 20s. The reason he chose 20s because he believed they would remember what they were thinking at teenagers and so on when you get older like us, you know. But he chose 1,000 people in their 20s, half male, half female, who used to go to church as kids, no longer go to church. And we asked him to bias it in the direction of they had to go to a conservative church because these are the best the results are going to be, to find out why they left the church. You know, one of the main reasons, it was hypocrisy. And when he asked, what do you mean by hypocrisy? They explained, by hypocrisy, it's going to church and being told, we believe the Bible here, trust in Jesus, but then being told, but we don't necessarily believe this part of the Bible, particularly when it came to the book of Genesis, and you can believe in millions of years and evolution and reinterpret that doesn't matter, but make sure you believe the rest. And they saw it as hypocrisy. They walked away from the church. Not only that, when we looked at the answers they gave to the questions, it showed clearly that they weren't taught how to defend their faith. They weren't taught apologetics. In fact, as I travel around the world today, I find I'm asked the same basic questions over and over again. How do you know the Bible's true? Where did the Bible come from? Where did God come from? Who made God? How do you know that there's a God? Why those 66 books? Anyway, carbon-14 disproves the Bible. What about dinosaurs? How do you explain that if the Bible's true? We know there wasn't a global flood. There's not enough water to cover the earth for a global flood. Noah couldn't fit all the animals on the ark. By the way, how many of you have heard those sorts of questions? Have you heard those sorts of questions? Yeah. And you know why? That's the era of history we live in. But instead of raising up generations who've got answers to those questions, who know how to defend their faith, you know what we tend to do? Teach Bible stories, and we say, well, I don't know the answers, doesn't matter anyway, but trust in Jesus. And what's happening is this. The secularists are capturing the hearts and minds of generations of our kids and teaching them why the Bible, from their perspective, can't be trusted and is not true. And instead of us raising up generations who know they can stand on God's word and it is the true history book of the universe and know how to defend their faith, we're letting the secularists capture generations of hearts and minds of our kids, and they're changing the culture. I used to be a science teacher in the public schools in Australia. And one of the first science lessons I taught, one of the students said, "Sir, you're a Christian." "That's right." "Well, you believe the Bible, but that can't be true. We know the Bible's not true." "Why is that?" "Because of what our textbooks teach us about ape men and about evolution." What I found was, when I was a teacher, that there were students in my classes in the public school who thought that they couldn't believe the Bible and they weren't prepared to listen to the message about Jesus Christ because their textbooks told them that they evolved and therefore, in their mind, the Bible wasn't true. And one of the things that I started to do then was to help them understand that evolution has not been proven by science, and actually, when you understand observational science, it actually confirms the Bible's history.
Have you ever heard this? Billions of years ago, there was an explosion in space. Or 100,000 years ago, this happened or that happened. Or even, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Question, how does anyone know? I mean, was anybody there to observe it? Well, actually, somebody was, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Check this out. First of all, we need to recognize that there is a huge difference between observational science and historical science.